wasn't very social in college. I didn't get good grades, I wasn't in a frat, I didn't have a girlfriend, and I wasn't very involved in anything. I wasn't a very happy kid. I'm not complaining though. I found a loyal girl who would never stop fighting for me in my late 30s. My life is good now. We live together with 2 cats named Blue and Raz, and I'm planning on proposing soon. Like I was saying though, I wasn't in a frat, so generic frat parties were kind of off the table for me. I still wanted to have fun though. I mean, who wouldn't? My friends Bryson and Ian were in the same boat. We spent most weekends killing time in Bryson's dorm. That being said, we took every chance we got when it came to parties. Most of the parties we were lucky enough to go to were off campus, meaning they weren't associated with any of the frats or the school itself. One time we actually drove over an hour just to go to a party. It's safe to say we were pretty desperate. One Friday afternoon, Ian texted the group chat saying the girl he was talking to knew of a party not that far away. Ian tended to attract the strangest girls. I'm sure you know the ones I'm talking about. Bryson joked that he didn't want to go to some death metal, emo anime party, which I kind of agreed with. Ian was pretty adamant though, and convinced us that this would be a normal party. It's not like we had anything better going on. Bryson convinced his brother Chris to be our designated driver. Chris didn't drink anyway, and said he'd be down for a party, so everything was looking good. As we were driving to the party, Ian started complaining about the girl he was talking to. He said she hadn't answered him in hours, which honestly wasn't too surprising considering the kind of guy Ian was. He was actually pretty torn, and said he was having second thoughts about even going, which seemed like an overreaction. We were already 30 minutes deep, so we weren't just gonna go turn around and go home. We told him to suck it up and not let it ruin the night. After a few more minutes, Ian said Callista's profile disappeared from his phone altogether. We broke it to him that he had been blocked and she probably decided to go to the party with someone else. He pouted for the rest of the drive. When we reached the party, we instantly knew we'd made the right choice. The house was massive, especially compared to the rest of the houses on the block. Ian didn't want to go in just yet, saying he needed a buzz to take his mind off the situation. Bryson and I didn't object to drinking, so we told Chris to park a little further down the street so we could pregame outside the car. We killed a few of the beers we had brought with us and watched as people entered the house in droves. It honestly looked like a pretty lit party. Once Ian was satisfied with his buzz, the 4 of us started making our way over to the house. As soon as we stepped inside, I could tell something was off. For starters, all the lights were on, like there was no ambient lighting throughout the entire house. Just the bright overhead lights that you'd expect to be off at a college party. Most of the people there were very nicely dressed, not what you'd expect people to wear at a rowdy party. The scene looked more like a fancy dinner party than anything else, but maybe that's what it was. After all, we didn't really have any details about what we were walking into. We didn't look too out of place, but the clothing differences were definitely noticeable. The music was also bizarre. They weren't playing trap or hip-hop or any of the usual party music. Instead, they were playing some kind of ethereal, almost druggy music. I'm not really sure what genre it was or how to describe it, but none of the songs had any words, just instruments. I guess it wasn't bad per se, but it was odd. My friends and I looked at each other, trying to make sense of what was going on. We drilled Ian for details, but he said he was just as clueless as we were. The 4 of us walked around a little, exploring the house. There was alcohol everywhere, so we helped ourselves. A few minutes in, I started noticing people catching my eye and then immediately looking away. It was actually so apparent that I started wondering if there was something in my teeth. I figured I was just getting looks because of what I was wearing, which did make sense to me at the time. The 4 of us were honestly having a good time, despite the weird atmosphere. Actually, I take that back. Chris was pretty bored and said he was going to go smoke in his car. We figured it was because he didn't have a drop of alcohol in him. A few minutes after he left, a group of girls approached us. We definitely weren't super confident, so getting approached was a new thing. The 3 of them started flirting with us almost immediately, like it wasn't even subtle. They joked about an entrance fee, which I thought was funny until I saw that they were being serious. They were holding a bottle of tequila, which we definitely weren't going to turn down. Without much thought, and not wanting to appear uncool, we swigged the bottle. After that point, the 6 of us stuck together, drinking, talking, and occasionally dancing. It was going really well. At one point, I noticed a weird mark on Tina's neck. It was a short but solid green line that looked like it had been drawn on in Sharpie. The line was pretty thin, and I probably wouldn't have noticed it had I not been standing so close to her. I debated asking her about it, but decided against it to avoid potentially offending her. It might have been a birthmark or something like that. Once I had seen it though, I couldn't unsee it. It just looked so unnatural, and green of all colors. Who wears green makeup? It couldn't have been a makeup smear. I decided to let it go and continued flirting with her, wondering where things would end up. Eventually, I saw Bryson and the girl he was with begin to wander off upstairs, which I was happy about. Pretty soon afterwards, I noticed Ian and his girl also walking towards the stairs. I was nervous to ask Tina anything suggestive because I didn't want to mess anything up. Despite the alcohol, I could feel myself getting really anxious and sweaty, so I told Tina I was going to the bathroom and that I'd be right back. The only bathroom I could find was occupied, so I stood outside the door and waited. Eventually, the door opened and a really tall, older-looking guy wearing a white button-down and linen pants stepped out. I rushed into the bathroom and he bumped into me. I turned around and kind of expected him to apologize, but he just stood there, staring at me. It was the strangest thing. He just stood there with this blank look, sizing me up. I was about to say something when I noticed what was on his neck. The same green line I had seen on Tina. It was literally identical. Against my better judgment, I asked him what his problem was. He smirked and shook his head before saying, "Who invited you?" Not knowing how to answer that, I blurted out Callista, the girl that had stood up Ian. He chuckled and looked up, like he knew who I was talking about. He looked back at me, his smile completely gone now. In a low voice, he repeated her name before gesturing around the party. "Do you see Callista here?" I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just slammed the door in his face, wondering what the hell had just happened. I couldn't get over what he said or that green mark on his neck. Part of me regretted not asking him more questions about what the hell was going on. I left the bathroom, looking for him. I walked past more people that eyed me up like I didn't belong. I didn't care though. I was gonna find my friends and drag them out of here. While wandering around the party, I couldn't stop thinking about that green mark. I started looking closely at people's necks, trying to see if anyone else had a mark on their neck. And to my horror, I actually saw 2 more people with the green lines on their necks. They were all the same color, same length, same thickness, same everything. It was freaky. I kept looking for that guy, all the while analyzing people's necks. Most people weren't marked up, but I kept catching glimpses of green lines on various people's necks. I was starting to freak out, so I made my way to the stairs, looking for my friends. Thankfully, as I was walking up the stairs, Bryson and Ian were walking down. I urged the 2 of them to follow me, and I brought them to an empty hallway so we could talk. I briefly told them about my theory and said we had to leave immediately. They burst out laughing and told me I was just drunk. Bryson told me I was just jealous because they had hooked up and I didn't. I asked him where his girl had gone, and he told me she had instructed him to meet back upstairs in 20 minutes. Ian said his girl told him the same thing. There was no reasoning with these 2. They were riding the high of a hookup. I told them to follow me and that I'd prove that people had strange marks on their necks, but they weren't budging. Just when I was about to give up, Ian turned to the side, and what I saw was actually horrifying. There was a thin line on his neck, only this one was red, not green. I practically screamed at him, which actually got them to listen to me. I then inspected Bryson's neck, and there was a red mark on his too. Ian told me to relax and that it was probably just a makeup stain, but Bryson started to believe me. I told them we were leaving, and Bryson and I turned to find the door. Ian still wouldn't leave, saying he wanted to meet back up with the girl. Just then, a random guy walked past us, eyeing each of us up separately. He didn't say anything, but paused long enough for us to notice the green line on his neck. That was it. Bryson and I rushed for the door with Ian close behind. It felt like everyone there was staring at us as we left, but no one moved to stop us. We ran to Chris's car and told him to drive. As we were leaving, both Ian and Bryson's phones started blowing up. Those girls were asking why we had left. How could they have even known that? They weren't even around to see us leave. My friends blocked the girls. Everyone I tell this story to has their own crazy theory about what happened that night. I really don't know what to think about it, but I don't think I want to know what might have happened had that guy not tipped me off. I'm a graduate student studying civil engineering at Purdue University. I actually started a few months ago. I was in a good place, all things considered. Classes were going well, I made a couple friends, and the apartment I found was decently priced. The landlord was pretty sketchy though. I had a car and lived pretty far away from campus, but I liked driving. The only downside, it was a sketchy part of town, but I didn't care much about that. I'm a guy in my mid-20s, so I figured I could handle myself. Yeah, things were a little boring, but I was there for a degree and not a party. Everything was pretty normal, until the day my backpack got stolen. I had left it on a table in a random hall to go to the bathroom like an idiot. By the time I got back, it was gone. Of course, that specific lecture hall didn't have cameras, so there was literally nothing I could do. I was more annoyed than anything. My wallet, keys, and laptop were in there. I had to cancel my cards and get new ones, report my keys missing to the landlord, and start looking for a replacement laptop. It was a whole thing. It sucked, but things happen. It wasn't until a few days later that I realized the situation was 1,000 times worse than I had anticipated. I drove home from campus one evening to find a handwritten note slipped under my door. I figured it was just a reminder from my landlord about something, but I was dead wrong. When I opened it up, it just said, "I see you." No name, no signature, just those 3 words. I instantly put 2 and 2 together. Whoever had stolen my backpack had gone through my laptop somehow and figured out where I lived. That was terrifying enough, but just then I had a thought that was so much worse. Whoever had stolen my backpack had my apartment keys. I felt my skin starting to itch, and I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone there. I ran into my apartment and slammed the door shut. I had a deadlock, so even if someone did try to break in, they wouldn't be able to get past that. Over the next week, I got more notes, all handwritten. They weren't long, just weird phrases like, "I know what you did," or "watch yourself." At that point, it was really starting to freak me out. I had never done anything wrong really, but if someone had gone through my laptop, who knows what they could have found? I really didn't know what to do. Would going to the police even help? I figured I'd wait it out a little longer, hoping whoever was messing with me would get bored. One night, I was getting ready for bed when I noticed something. It was dark outside and my blinds were half closed, but I could have sworn I saw a flash, like someone took a picture of me. I quickly pulled the blinds down, but my heart was racing. There was no one there. Things didn't stop there. I started noticing small things around my apartment, things being moved. At first, I thought I was just being careless. My shoes would be in a different spot, or my coat would be draped over the chair instead of hung up. It was little things that I could explain away if I really tried. But then, one day, I came home to find my bedsheets stripped off and my room completely turned upside down. My dresser drawers were pulled out, my books scattered across the floor. It looked like someone had torn through the place. I called the cops, of course, but they didn't do much. No forced entry, nothing stolen, so there was not much they could do apparently. I asked my landlord to change the locks, but he said it would take at least 2 days to get someone out. I begged him to make it happen sooner, but he shrugged it off, saying it wasn't an emergency. I felt betrayed. How in the world could this guy not think that this was an emergency? I kept pressuring him to do something, but he eventually stopped answering, no matter what I said. That was literally yesterday as I'm writing this. I barely slept at all last night, even though I was safe with the deadlock in place. I'm thinking of changing the locks myself, but I'm not sure how I could even do that without causing expensive damage. I called out of all my classes this morning because I'm afraid to leave my room. I'm still here, writing all this down. I'm prepared to confront whoever it is if they come back. I'm sure if they went through my laptop, they would know my class schedule. Maybe I'll hide somewhere and get the jump on them if they try to enter while I'm supposed to be at class. I think that's what I'm gonna do. I'll give an update when I can. I've been having an ongoing issue that I can't keep to myself anymore. I had just broken up with my boyfriend of 2 years, Ben. It wasn't a bad breakup, but it wasn't great either. We'd been arguing for months, and it was obvious things weren't going to work out. So, when we finally ended things, I thought it was for the best. I blocked him on everything, and that was that. I go to Temple University, and I live in this small apartment near campus. It's on the second floor of an older building, which means I can hear pretty much everything going on outside. A few days after the breakup, I started hearing strange noises at night. Not like regular city sounds, these were different. Footsteps, quiet shuffling, like someone was just outside my window. At first, I figured it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Eventually, though, I came to terms that it was probably my ex. The reason I wasn't really freaking out was because Ben was one of the sweetest and most harmless guys there was. I mean that in a nice way, like he'd never do anything drastic or anything to hurt me. I figured he just missed me, so I decided to let it go. Eventually, he'd get bored. Plus, I was already stressed from the breakup, and I had this huge group project due. That project is actually a huge component to this story. I was the one responsible for editing the project and sending it to our professor. I worked on it all night, making sure everything was perfect, and I emailed it just before midnight. Relieved to have it done, I went to bed, trying not to think about all the other things going wrong in my life. The next day in class, we were supposed to present the video. My professor plugged in his laptop and pulled up the file I'd sent. I was nervous, but I was also kind of proud of what we'd done. I had a lot of experience with Adobe products, and I knew our video was probably a cut above all the other groups. And then the video started playing, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't our project. Instead, there was this grainy video of someone wearing a scream mask. The person wasn't just sitting there, they were talking. They were saying horrible things about me, my professor, the government. It was disgusting. I don't even want to repeat what was said. That's how sick it was. My professor let the video play out a little longer than he should have, probably because he was also in shock. When he did pause it though, his face was pale. I was frozen in place. I have never been so mortified in my life. I was literally frozen. I wanted to cry, but I couldn't. I could barely breathe. I felt hundreds of eyes on me. The rest of the class was staring at me. I knew what they were thinking. After the most painful seconds of my life, I snapped out of my humiliation and burst out into tears before running out of the lecture hall. I felt a panic attack coming on. I debated going home, but I knew I'd definitely get expelled if I just left. Reluctantly, I waited outside the building for the class to end before approaching my professor. I basically pleaded with him that I had no idea what happened, that I was positive I had sent the right video. He decided to hear me out and confirmed that 2 videos had been sent. The first one was my project, and the more recent one was the one he played in class. Clearing things up with the university took a lot of time and hassle, but I was eventually able to do it. I won't bore you with the details. Nothing was going to erase the humiliation, though. It was also clear that my email had been hacked, which was a much bigger problem. I changed my password and thought I had just gotten super unlucky. That's when things got worse. Not 1 week later, I woke up to being logged out of Snapchat. That only happens when someone else logs in, which meant I had gotten hacked there too. I don't even want to think about what they found. There was a lot of stuff on my Snapchat I don't feel comfortable talking about. I called the police, told them everything, and to my surprise, Ben agreed to let them question him. The police were able to confirm that Ben wasn't behind any of it. He did, however, admit that he posted my private information on some online forum right after we broke up. He swore he never posted any of my passwords, but my passwords were easy to guess, and like an idiot, I used the same password for everything. The police told me that there wasn't much they could do. Ben wasn't responsible for the hacking. That's when the full gravity of the situation hit me. Someone else had basically all of my private information. They could probably blackmail me. I changed my passwords immediately, but it might have been too late by then. A few weeks went by and nothing happened. My best guess is that whoever was tormenting me realized I had gotten the police involved and didn't want to risk being caught. I thought that was the end of it. Of course, it wasn't. One day, some random person added me on Snapchat, which wasn't too unusual. When I added them back, though, they started sending me pictures of me. I'm sure you can guess the types of things they were sending. I blocked them before they could threaten me, which I'm sure they were about to do. I burst into tears. I've never felt more helpless in my life. For about a week, random profiles would add me on Snapchat. I knew it was the same person, and I never accepted their ads out of fear that they would blackmail me or ask for money. This has been ongoing for about a week now, and I don't know what to do. There's literally no evidence or any way I can track this person. The police don't have enough information to get involved, and it's not like they could do anything anyway. The worst part is they literally know my address and whatever else about my personal life. If I keep ignoring their Snapchat ads, they might do something drastic. They've already lurked outside my apartment. I wouldn't put it past them to go further. I'm praying that they get bored and just quit. For any young ladies listening, be careful about what kind of pictures are on your phone. I don't know if this will ever end.
Room 213. It all went down during my junior year, just after winter break. Everyone was still shaking off the holiday rust, trying to get back into the school routine, but there was this weird vibe around. Maybe it was the cold weather, or maybe it was the rumors flying around about the old science wing. See, our school is ancient, like really old. Parts of it go back to the early 1900s. The science wing had been shut down for years. They said it was due to asbestos or some other health hazard, but there was always these stories. Some kids swore a kid went missing there back in the 80s. Others said it was haunted by a janitor who died in the basement. I never really bought into any of it, not until that week. I had detention after school that day, which sucked enough on its own. Mr. Baxter, our gym teacher, was running it. He clearly didn't want to be there either. He handed out some pointless worksheets and then sat in the corner glued to his phone. About a half hour in, he got up, mumbled something about checking on the locker room, and dipped out, leaving us alone. Nate, one of the guys in detention with me, leaned over. "Hey, want to do something fun?" he whispered. I shrugged. "Sure, anything's better than this." He grinned. "Let's go check out the science wing." My stomach sank a bit. "You serious? That place is locked up." Nate just laughed. "I know a way in. There's a loose window by the art room that's always open. Come on, don't be a chicken." He glanced over at Alice and Derek, the other two stuck in detention with us. "You guys in?" he asked. Alice looked like she'd rather eat glass, but Derek's eyes lit up. "Hell yeah," he said. I didn't want to look like a wimp, so I nodded. We waited until we were sure Mr. Baxter wasn't coming back, then snuck out of the classroom and headed to the back hallway. Just like Nate said, there was a window he could pry open. One by one, we climbed through and dropped into the old, dusty corridor of the science wing. The place was freezing and smelled like mold. There was no electricity, so we used our phones to see. The hallway stretched out ahead of us, lined with old classrooms. The doors were chipped and covered in peeling paint. Nate led the way, and we followed, whispering and snickering like we were in some kind of lame horror movie. But as we moved deeper into the wing, the air got colder, and something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I didn't like it. We reached the end of the hallway, where this big old wooden door stood. Nate tried the handle, but it was locked. "Figures," he muttered. Alice seemed relieved, like she was ready to bail, but Derek spotted a narrow staircase heading down. "What about the basement?" he suggested. Just the thought of going down there gave me the chills. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said, but Nate was already moving toward it. "Come on, just a quick look. Don't be a wuss," he said over his shoulder. I sighed, and we all headed down, the stairs creaking loudly under our feet. The deeper we went, the darker it got. At the bottom, we found another hallway. It seemed even more decayed than the upstairs one. Old lockers lined the walls, and there were these tiny windows high up, letting in just a sliver of light from outside. It wasn't much, but enough to cast long, creepy shadows on the floor. We stopped in front of a door marked Room 213. It didn't fit with the rest of the place. The handle looked new and the paint was fresh. Derek reached for the door, and even though my gut told me this was a bad idea, none of us said anything. The door creaked open into pitch black. Our phone lights barely made a dent in the darkness. The room felt bigger than it should have been, way bigger than any classroom upstairs. Nate stepped inside, and I followed, Alice and Derek right behind. We stood there, not sure what to do next, when we heard it, a soft weeping sound, like a broom moving slowly over the floor just beyond the wall ahead. The hairs on my arm stood up. We aimed our lights toward the noise, but we couldn't see anything. The sound got louder, like it was coming closer. We panicked and made a run for it, scrambling up the stairs. Nate was first, then Derek and Alice, and with me bringing up the rear. Just before I reached the top, I glanced back. That's when I saw it, a black shape stretching out on the floor, moving with the sound, like a shadow with no person to cast it. It seemed to grow, sliding closer, almost like it was reaching for us. I felt this jolt of fear, like ice running through my veins. I turned and bolted up the last few steps, feeling that cold creeping up my back. I didn't say a word, just ran faster until I caught up with the others. We sprinted back to the window, climbed out, and didn't stop until we were back in the main building. Weeks went by, and we pretended everything was cool. But every now and then, I'd catch Nate or Alice giving me this look, like they were still thinking about what happened. I didn't say anything about the shadow I saw. I didn't want to freak them out more. But then, one day, I heard that sound again. It was summer break, and I had a part-time job at the school to make some cash. The place was dead with all the kids gone. One hot afternoon, I was mopping the hallway near the gym. The air was heavy and still. I glanced out the window and saw something out back. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at, but then I saw him, or thought I did. It didn't make sense. It was just me and Mr. Thompson, the janitor, working that day. But there was this old man out there, sweeping the ground with his giant old-school broom, like something from another century. We hadn't used brooms like that in forever. Everything's been modernized for years. But there he was, hunched over, sweeping back and forth, and the sound seeming to get louder in the stillness. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. I called out to him just to see if he was real or if my mind was playing tricks. He didn't respond, just kept sweeping like he didn't hear me. A chill ran down my spine. I had to know for sure, so I dropped the mop and ran downstairs to the courtyard as fast as I could. But when I got there, the man was gone. The broom was gone too. There wasn't a trace of anyone ever being there. Then it hit me. That sound. The sweeping. It was the same noise we heard in the basement last winter. My skin prickled with that familiar dread. I didn't want to think about it anymore. I grabbed my stuff and clocked out early. I didn't bother telling Mr. Thompson or anyone else. They'd think I was losing it. But I knew what I heard and saw, and I knew I wouldn't forget it. I still work at the school, but I stay away from the science wing and never stay late. I don't know who or what I saw that day, but I know one thing. The man in the courtyard and the shadow in the basement had to be the same, and I'm done trying to figure out what they are. The day Ethan snapped. There was a kid in my school named Ethan. He was in a few of my classes, chemistry, history, gym, but I didn't know much about him. He was the quiet type, always keeping to himself, head down, eyes on the floor. People said he was weird. Some said his parents were these overbearing freaks who didn't let him out much. Others said he'd been expelled from his last school for fighting. Whatever the reason, he wasn't like the rest of us, and he didn't seem to care. The first time I noticed Ethan was in chemistry. He sat in the back, scribbling in this beat-up notebook while the teacher droned on about reactions and compounds. I remember he'd always draw these strange diagrams, circuits, numbers, formulas that looked way too advanced for what we were learning. He muttered things under his breath sometimes, things about how the government was lying to us, or how the school was trying to brainwash us. The teacher would just roll her eyes and move on, but you could tell she didn't like him much. Ethan didn't really have any friends. Most people ignored him, but Jason and Mike weren't like most people. Jason and Mike had a thing for picking on kids who stood out, who didn't fit in. They were always looking for someone to push around, and Ethan was an easy target. I'd seen them knock his books out of his hands, shove him into lockers, trip him in the halls. It was like a game to them, and Ethan never reacted. He just stood there, taking it, with this weird little smile on his face that made me uneasy. It pissed them off. They wanted him to fight back, to get angry. But he never did. He just smiled and watched them, like he was amused by the whole thing. I guess that's what made them push harder. I remember that day in chemistry class. It started out like any other. Ethan was in his usual spot at the back, hunched over his notebook, drawing something I couldn't make out. Jason and Mike were sitting a few rows ahead, whispering to each other, glancing back at him now and then. I could tell they were planning something. They always had that look when they were about to cause trouble. About halfway through the period, Jason got up and walked over to Ethan's desk. He grabbed the notebook out of his hands and held it up like it was a prize. "What's this, Ethan? Your plans for world domination?" he mocked, flipping through the pages. Mike laughed and snatched a page, crumpling it up, throwing it across the room. A few kids snickered, but most just pretended not to notice. Ethan didn't react. He just sat there, watching them with that same eerie smile. It was like he didn't care. Then, without a word, he stood up, turned around, and walked out of the classroom. The teacher barely looked up from her desk. She probably figured he was just going to the bathroom. Jason and Mike exchanged glances. I could see the confusion on their faces. But then Jason grinned. "Where do you think you're going?" he called after Ethan. Ethan didn't answer. He just kept walking. Jason shrugged and looked at Mike. "Let's go see what the freak's up to," he said. They both got up and followed him out, laughing. I watched them go, feeling that familiar knot in my stomach. Something about the way Ethan had walked out. so calm, so deliberate, made me feel uneasy. I wanted to get up and see what was going on, but I stayed in my seat, trying to focus on the lesson. Minutes passed, 5, 10, 15. The bell rang for the next period, and they still hadn't come back. The teacher called Jason and Mike's names, but when they didn't answer, she just shrugged and moved on. I heard some kids whispering, wondering where they'd gone, but no one seemed too concerned. By lunchtime, people started to notice. Jason and Mike still hadn't shown up. The teachers were asking around, checking the bathrooms, the gym, even the janitor's closet. Nothing. I overheard the principal talking to a few other staff members. He sounded worried, saying he was going to call their parents. It was getting dark when the news spread that Mike had been found. I saw him from across the parking lot, stumbling toward the school, his face pale, his clothes covered in dirt and blood. He was shouting something, his voice hoarse and frantic. A couple of teachers ran over to him and I followed. Mike was shaking, barely able to stand. I caught a few words. "Jason, Woods, Ethan's lost it." His eyes were wide, terrified, darting around like he thought someone was watching. He kept repeating Jason's name over and over, like he couldn't say anything else. The police showed up pretty fast after that. They got a bunch of flashlights and headed out into the woods, with a few teachers and some older kids who had volunteered to help. I went with them, even though I knew I probably shouldn't have. I needed to see what was going on. It didn't take long to find Jason. He was tied to a tree, his face swollen and bloody, a rag stuffed in his mouth. His hands were bound with some kind of wire, metal clamps digging into his wrists. There was this small homemade generator on the ground, wires running from it to clamps on his hands. A hockey stick lay nearby, broken and covered in blood. I stood there, frozen, staring at the scene. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Jason was alive, but he was in bad shape. They cut him loose and rushed him back to the school, but he didn't say much. His eyes were glazed over, and he kept mumbling Ethan's name like he was still out there, still coming for him. And Ethan? He was gone. They searched the woods for hours, maybe even days, but there was no trace of him. It was like he disappeared into thin air. The police put out a notice and said he was wanted for questioning, but he never showed up. They put his face on posters, but after a while, people stopped looking. They didn't want to think about it anymore. Jason came back to school a few weeks later, but he wasn't the same. He wouldn't talk about what happened, not to anyone. If you asked him, he'd just shake his head and walk away. His hands were still bandaged. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. People started saying Ethan had finally snapped, that he had been pushed too far and decided to fight back in the only way he knew how. Others said he'd lost his mind, and he had gone out into the woods and become some kind of ghost, waiting for someone else to push him. I don't know what happened to Ethan. I don't think anyone does. But sometimes, when I'm walking home late or sitting in a quiet classroom, I feel like he's still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. And I can't help but wonder if one day he'll come back. And this time, he won't just disappear. Lockdown 1. It was a normal Wednesday morning in high school. I was sitting in Miss Ellison's English class, halfway listening to her talk about Shakespeare, when the PA system suddenly crackled to life. The speaker's voice was calm, but somehow it made my stomach drop. Lockdown. This is a lockdown. All students and staff, please remain in your classrooms, turn off the lights, and lock all doors and windows. For a second, everyone just looked around at each other, like, is this real? Just a drill, right? A few kids even giggled nervously. But then someone from down the hall screamed, "There's a gun!" And just like that, it hit us. This wasn't a drill. My heart started pounding, and I felt this wave of fear wash over the whole room. Miss Ellison's face changed too. She was trying to stay calm, but you could see the fear creeping in. She went straight to the door, locked it, and switched off the lights. We were plunged into this creepy darkness. My heart racing now, I could feel the energy in the room shift from confusion to full-blown panic. Miss Ellison pulled out her phone, her face lit up by the screen, and I could see her fingers flying across it. She looked up, and I swear her eyes were wide, her mouth tight, like seriously freaked out. I'd never seen her like that before. "Everyone against the wall," she whispered, but with this urgency that made us all scramble like crazy. I ended up right next to the door, and Miss Ellison was beside me. The room was filled with nervous whispers. A few girls were crying softly, and some guys were just staring around wide-eyed. It was so quiet I could literally hear my heart beating in my ears. Then, from somewhere down the hall, we heard it. A loud bang on a door, followed by footsteps. heavy, deliberate footsteps coming closer. The air was so tense, it felt like no one even dared to breathe. The footsteps got louder and louder until they stopped, right outside our door. I glanced up and saw a shadow through the glass. It was a man, and he was staring into our classroom. His eyes seemed to lock onto mine for a split second, and I swear there was this weird feeling of familiarity, but I was too freaked out to figure it out. He tried the door handle and rattled it hard, sending another wave of panic through the room. I heard a few gasps, and some kids started crying, and then he shouted, "Emily, open up! I know you're in there!" It hit me like a truck. Emily. That's Miss Ellison's first name. The man wasn't just here for anyone. He was here for her. I turned to look at Miss Ellison. She was pale, her hand over her mouth, tears in her eyes. She looked terrified, like more scared than I've ever seen anyone. And then it clicked. I knew who he was. Her boyfriend. I'd seen him in a photo on Facebook just days ago. The guy started banging on the door harder and harder, shouting her name over and over. The noise was insane, and everyone was losing it. But then he stopped. His hand went to his pocket, and my stomach dropped. I knew what was coming. He pulled out a gun. He raised it, pointed it directly at the door. But no, not at the door, at me. Or rather at Miss Ellison, who was right next to me. Time seemed to slow. My brain was screaming at me to do something, anything. I didn't even think. I just shoved Miss Ellison with all my strength, pushed her to the ground, and dove right after her. And then, bang! A gunshot shattered the glass on the door, spraying tiny shards everywhere. The whole room erupted into chaos. Kids were screaming, crying, just freaking out. And then another gunshot from outside, followed by a thud and a scream of pain. "Get down!" I heard Mr. Harris, the math teacher, shout. "Drop the gun!" yelled Mr. Robertson, the PE teacher. Then a crazy struggle, like bodies hitting walls, shouting, the whole thing. I lifted my head, my ears ringing, just in time to see red and blue lights flashing through the broken window. Sirens were blaring, getting closer. Mr. Harris had tackled the guy to the ground, and Mr. Robertson had managed to grab the gun. Within minutes, the police stormed in, barking commands, and they took over. The guy was cuffed and dragged out, still screaming Miss Ellison's name like a maniac. We just sat there, completely stunned, trying to process what the hell had just happened. Miss Ellison was still shaking, tears streaming down her face. It hit me how close we'd come to something way worse. Later, the cops questioned us, and we were told that the guy, her boyfriend, had shown up all angry and unhinged, thinking she'd betrayed him. He'd come to the school ready to end it all right there in front of us. It was hours before they let us leave, and when we did, I saw Miss Ellison, still giving her statement to the police, looking completely shattered. I realized just how quickly things could go from normal to insane. In the days that followed, everyone had their own version of what happened, but honestly, none of us will ever forget that moment the guy pointed his gun at us. It's burned into my mind forever, man. Lockdown 2. I was new to Riverview High School. Having worked there for nearly a month, it was a small-town school in southern Illinois, where everyone seemed to know everyone, the kind of place where you felt like nothing truly dangerous could ever happen. But I was wrong. It was October 12th, 2004, a Tuesday like any other. I just finished teaching my third period math class and headed to the teacher's lounge for a quick break before lunch duty. Linda, the history teacher, and Grace, a newer English teacher like me, were already there, chatting about their morning. I grabbed a coffee and joined them. We were all tired, just making small talk to pass the time. Then, out of nowhere, the door swung open with a bang. A man in a black ski mask, around 6'1" and holding a pistol, stormed into the room. He didn't say anything, just raised the gun and pointed it straight at Linda. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. Grace and I froze, instinctively raising our hands, too stunned to do anything else. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. The man charged at Lydia, grabbed her arm, and slammed her against the wall. She let out a small cry, and I could see her eyes widening in fear. Grace and I stayed perfectly still, hoping not to draw any attention to ourselves. The man didn't even glance at us. His focus was entirely on Linda. He kept his gun trained on her, his voice low and threatening, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. I was so scared. I glanced at the door. It was still open. Then a thought hit me. Could I slip out of here? If I could, I might be able to alert the school. I looked back at the man, but he was too close. For what felt like 5 minutes, I just watched him, waiting, hoping for any moment he might get distracted. Then he turned his head slightly, looking over his shoulder, still gripping Linda's arm tight. That was my chance. I slid out of my chair, keeping as low as possible, and slowly edged toward the door. I glanced back at Grace. She was shaking, her eyes darting between me and the man. She was freaking out, and so was I. Even now, I can't really explain how I found the guts to make that move. I just remembered wanting to get out of there, to warn the others about him, or maybe it was just because I didn't want to die. Once I slipped through the door and into the hallway, I took off running straight toward the PA room. The hall was empty and felt longer than ever before. Every step echoed around me, but I forced myself to keep moving. I reached the PA system, grabbed the microphone, and pressed the button. "This is a lockdown. Secure all classrooms immediately. This is not a drill," I yelled into the mic, my voice sharp with urgency. I slammed my hand down on the alarm, and the sirens began wailing through the halls. Chaos erupted instantly. I could hear chairs scraping, doors slamming, and students screaming. I could hear teachers shouting, trying to get everyone inside. I grabbed the phone quickly, dialing 911, giving them the basics, then hung up and ran back into the hallway. The scene was madness. Kids were running in every direction, some shouting, some crying. It was lunchtime, so most were out in the halls or cafeteria. I pushed through the crowd, yelling, "Get inside! Lock your doors!" I tried to help where I could, guiding students toward the nearest classroom. In the cafeteria, I saw kids pouring out, panic etched on their faces. Teachers were trying to direct them, but it was chaos. I kept shouting, waving my arms to get their attention. "This way! Hurry!" I pushed a group of younger students towards an open door, practically shoving them inside. Finally, the hall started to clear. I ducked into a classroom, pulling the door shut behind me. The room was dark, the lights off, and the kids inside were huddled together on the floor, some whispering, others crying softly. I locked the door and turned to face them. "Stay quiet," I whispered, my voice as calm as I could make it. "Stay low. Don't make a sound." We waited in that darkness. I could feel the fear in the room, hear the muffled sobs, the soft breathing. The tension was suffocating. Every second felt like an hour. Then 2 gunshots rang out from down the hallway. The sound was deafening in the silence. The kids started screaming, some breaking into tears. I raised my hand, motioning to them to be quiet. "Shh, it's okay. Stay low," I whispered. But my heart was racing, my mind imagining the worst. The minutes dragged on. Suddenly, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out completely. The room plunged into darkness, the silence growing heavier. For what felt like forever, there was nothing but stillness. Then faintly, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer. I held my breath, listening, my pulse pounding in my ears. The steps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside the door. I could see a shadow through the small window, a tall figure, masked, the man. He stopped, standing still, and I felt the air go thick with fear. I watched, waiting, praying he would move on. He stood there for a moment. Then, finally, he walked away. I exhaled, but this tension didn't leave. The sirens outside were louder now, the sound of police cars approaching. Relief was so close. Just then, I heard a loud bang from down the hallway, a door being kicked open, more screams, and then a voice shouting for quiet. The fear was like a knife in my gut. I couldn't see, but I knew what was happening. The man had broken into another classroom. I glanced at the kids around me. They were holding their breath, trying to stay silent, but I could see the fear in their eyes. I was thinking it too. He could come back for us. Then, suddenly, a voice rang out, loud, commanding. I could hear it through the walls, muffled but clear. The police. They were here. I heard them shouting, negotiating, trying to reason with him, trying to get him to release the hostage. The minutes felt like hours. Every word from outside was a lifeline, but we didn't know if it would hold. Finally, I heard a loud scuffle, more shouting. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear. The sound of heavy boots, doors slamming open, then silence. Moments later, I heard the officers' voices again, calmer this time. They had him. They'd taken him down. The SWAT team had moved in and rescued the hostages without any injuries. The gunshots I had heard earlier were fired into the ceiling, a sign of frustration, a desperate attempt to show the masked man was serious. It turned out that the man was David Larson, a former teacher who had been fired 2 months ago after he had harassed Rebecca Evans, Linda's daughter. And Linda, his target, was the one who had pressed charges, who had made sure he faced the consequences. As they led him away, I felt a wave of relief, but the fear didn't fade. We'd come so close to something much worse. Standing there, watching the students being escorted to safety, I realized that no matter how safe we thought we were, the unthinkable could always happen. And that was something none of us would forget. Lockdown 3. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind of day most students were off, either at home or hanging out with friends. At my school, we didn't have too many of those days. Our school is known for its sports program. Everybody who walked in through those doors knew we were all about winning. We had a state-of-the-art sports complex, complete with a rugby pitch, 2 basketball courts, and a large pool that I called my second home. I was a last-year student and a member of the swim team. I spent more time in that pool than I did in any classroom. That Saturday, I was getting in some extra practice for an upcoming competition. I wasn't alone, though. My teammates, Ethan and Jake, were there too, pushing themselves hard as we always did. But by late afternoon, they had had enough. "I'm out, man," Ethan said, pulling himself out of the pool and reaching for his towel. "Gotta save some energy for next week." "Yeah, same here," Jake added, already headed toward the locker room. "You coming?" "Nah," I replied. "I'll take a few more laps." They both shrugged, and with a wave, they left. The pool area felt quiet, except for the faint hum of the overhead lights and the soft lapping of water against the tiles. I slipped back into my rhythm, gliding through the water, my thoughts solely on my strokes and the upcoming meet. But then, in the middle of a lap, I heard it, a crackling noise overhead. I stopped and treaded water listening. The intercom crackled to life, and a voice, strained and urgent, echoed across the empty sports complex. "Attention! The school is now under lockdown. I repeat, the school is now under lockdown." The announcement repeated a few more times, and then the alarm started blaring, a loud, shrill noise that set my heart racing. Suddenly the lights went out, plunging the pool area into darkness, followed by a chilling silence. I froze, ears straining to catch any sound, but there was nothing, just my own ragged breath and the faint echo of water dripping somewhere. I needed to get out of the pool. It wasn't the best place to hide if something was really going down. I began to glide quietly to the pool's edge, my eyes darting around in the darkness, looking for any sign of movement. That's when I heard them. Footsteps. Not just one pair, but 2. They were getting closer, headed straight for the pool. At first I thought it might be a teacher or security coming to get me out, but then I heard voices. Low, hushed whispers that didn't sound like any teacher I knew. "You go that way. I'll check this side," one of them said. I felt a chill run down my spine. I peeked up from the water, squinting in the dark, and saw a faint beam of light bobbing around. A flashlight. My heart pounded against my ribs. I had no choice. I took a deep breath and dove down, sinking to the bottom of the pool. Underwater, the world was distorted, everything muffled and almost muted. I could see the beam of the flashlight piercing the surface, moving slowly across the water. At first, it seemed to stay near the edge, but then it started to come closer, inching toward the center of the pool where I was hiding. My pulse quickened as I realized they were searching the water, looking for something or someone. The light got closer, its beam cutting through the water like a knife, illuminating the tiled floor just a few feet from where I hovered. I pressed myself lower, trying to flatten my body against the bottom, feeling the cold pressure of the water all around me. My lungs burned, and the need to surface clawed at my throat, but I couldn't risk it. I watched as the flashlight beam swayed back and forth, almost lazily, as if taunting me with how close it was getting. Just when I thought I couldn't hold it any longer, I heard a new voice, slightly panicked. "Dude, we gotta go! The cops are already here!" The flashlight lingered a second longer, and then it abruptly lifted and swung away. I heard hurried footsteps moving back toward the entrance. I waited until I was sure they were gone before I finally surfaced, gasping for breath. I stayed there, my arms resting on the pool's edge, taking deep, desperate gulps of air until my heart slowed down enough to think straight. I pulled myself out of the water and grabbed my towel, wrapping it around myself as I made my way to the locker room. Just then the lights flickered back on, flooding the complex with blinding brightness. I quickly changed clothes and reached for my phone. A notification popped up on the screen, a post on Facebook. Someone had spotted 2 strange guys breaking into the school, triggering the lockdown. The post was 15 minutes old, followed by another update from the school saying that the situation was under control, but that the intruders hadn't been found. They were still out there, somewhere, maybe waiting for another chance to get inside, and I'd be right in the middle of it. The Stranger on the Bus. Spring of my last year at Ridgemont High was packed. I was juggling classes, trying to keep my grades up and doing everything I could to make my college applications look better. Twice a week on Wednesdays and Fridays, I'd go over to Westfield, this rougher neighborhood about 20 minutes away by bus, to tutor kids. I'd finish my last class around 4 p.m., rush to the bus stop, and teach for an hour before heading back to school for my study sessions. Getting to the community center where I tutored wasn't far, maybe 300 feet from the bus stop, but the walk always made me a little uneasy. The street was narrow and lined with homeless people. Some were wrapped in blankets, others looking through garbage, and just a few staring off into space. I'd been doing it for a few months, so I was pretty used to it, but I still kept my head down and walked fast. That Friday, though, something felt off. I finished tutoring around 5:30 p.m., packed up my stuff, and started walking back to the bus stop. You know that feeling when you just know someone's behind you? I felt that. I glanced back, and there he was, a man, scruffy looking, in a dirty jacket and a cap pulled low over his face, his hair sticking out in all directions. I tried to play it cool, thinking he was probably just another guy heading to the bus stop. When the bus pulled up, I got on, took my usual seat near the back, right in front of the last row. The guy got on right after me and sat down in the row behind me. As he passed, I couldn't help but notice his shoes, old sneakers, stained and covered in mud, with the soles worn thin. They looked like they had been through a lot. I tried to